Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first video of our Chapter 16 material. Chapter 16 covers the autonomic nervous system. So you might want to go back to the very beginning of Chapter 12. There was a flowchart of all of the components of the nervous system as a whole. So the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. Within the peripheral nervous system, we had the afferent and the efferent divisions, and then within the efferent divisions, we had somatic versus autonomic nervous system. So if that doesn't make sense to you, you might want to go back and review and kind of see where this chapter fits into the relationship of all of the nervous system stuff. This first video is just going to be a brief overview of the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And then the rest of the videos will cover those individually. So one for sympathetic, one for parasympathetic, and then one for kind of the extra stuff that's at the end of the chapter. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to describe some key differences in structure between the somatic and autonomic nervous systems, and then I'll talk about kind of the functions of those two divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So that's the main goal for this video. So to get started, I want to remind us, so I'm just going to draw a line right down the middle here. The picture on the left, this is what we have learned up to this point in the somatic nervous system, going all the way back to chapter 10 with skeletal muscle contraction control, and then chapter 14 with brain anatomy, and chapter 13 with spinal cord anatomy. So when we are talking about the somatic nervous system, this is control of your skeletal muscles. Those are the only effectors that our somatic nervous system has control over because they're the conscious control, right? So if you remember, going back from chapter 14, our precentral gyrus, right, that ridge just anterior to that central sulcus, this was our primary motor cortex. So it's the primary motor cortex because this is the site in the brain where the higher level motor neurons originate. The signal for that muscle contraction starts here. So then it travels down to different regions in the brain, the brain stem, or the spinal cord. So those red neurons are the central nervous system neurons. The black neurons in that picture are the motor neurons. So remember our multipolar motor neuron fires and communicates to your skeletal muscle fiber. The skeletal muscle fiber contracts, right? So we have that pathway here. So it's a single motor neuron pathway from the central nervous system to the effector, in this case, the skeletal muscle fiber. So that's everything. Should be review, should be comfortable with that information. Now on the right-hand side, structurally, so this is our structural difference. If you remember from chapter 14, again, kind of going back to the brain, in our hypothalamus, right, in our hypothalamus, this little center guy, part of the diencephalon, you can go back to the section in chapter 14 if you need to, but there were autonomic nuclei. The parasympathetic division nuclei and the sympathetic division nuclei were kind of housed in the hypothalamus of the diencephalon. These are our higher level neurons, if you will. So these are our central nervous system neurons. And again, they'll travel to somewhere in the brain stem or they'll travel down to the spinal cord to communicate to our motor neurons. They're going to be in the periphery. Now, the main difference here structurally is instead of having one motor neuron from the spinal cord to the effector, there's actually two motor neurons. So I got to draw a little bit smaller here. So the first motor neuron, which was what we call the preganglionic neuron right here. Okay, those are the red ones. Kind of outline them in purple. So the preganglionic neurons come from the CNS, and then they go and they synapse with a second motor neuron. Okay. The second motor neuron is called the ganglionic neuron, or sometimes called the postganglionic neuron, or postganglionic fiber. So there is a kind of series of neurons that go from the CNS to the effector. And what are the effectors of the autonomic nervous system? this box right here. Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and sometimes adipocytes in your fat tissue. We don't really talk about the fat too much. So smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. Those are things you do not have conscious control over. So they do not fit onto the somatic nervous system side of this diagram. They are only controlled by this particular pathway of these visceral or autonomic motor neurons. So the signal starts in the hypothalamus, travels down to either the brainstem or the spinal cord. Preganglionic neuron goes to a ganglia, to synapse, to a postganglionic fiber, which will then communicate to the effector, right? So that effector could be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands in my little diagram. So what we're going to focus on in the rest of this chapter is this right half of this diagram is all of the details, all of the pathway, all the possible ways that these pre and post ganglionic neurons can communicate to their effectors and how they regulate this subconscious level of control of things that we don't consciously control. Okay. All right, so that's the structural difference. I do also include this picture I got from another resource because I kind of liked the color coding and the visual of this as well. So again, we have our divider line. So on the left, it's showing the somatic motor. So remember, it is a single motor neuron pathway from the spinal cord or brainstem, from your central nervous system to your effector. In this case, they're showing the intercostal muscles, which you should remember from 231. Another thing that you can recall, you may or may not recall, is remember when we were talking about spinal cord anatomy and the gray horns? The anterior gray horns were somatic motor control. So the cell bodies leave the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord to then go out via your peripheral nerves. So you're working on peripheral nerves from chapter 13 to innervate your skeletal muscle. And these, are myelinated. So we can see the Schwann cells running along the length of that axon. Okay, so again, that's all review. That's stuff that we've covered before. The new stuff, kind of just pictured here slightly differently than what we saw on the last slide. So we have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. We haven't distinguished between those yet, but we can see the same pattern of this two motor neuron pathway. For part of this neural control, do you guys remember the lateral gray horns? Lateral gray horns were visceral motor control. So if you're reviewing your spinal cord anatomy, this is exactly what that lateral gray horn in segments T1 to L2, that's where you're going to find that lateral gray horn. It will be able to send that first motor neuron called the preganglionic neuron to an autonomic ganglia. And we're going to learn all the details of the different kind of places that this can be. And if you'll notice, the preganglionic neurons are also myelinated. And then same with your parasympathetic as well. They just kind of start at a different location up in the brainstem or the sacral part of the spinal cord. But the preganglionic neuron is myelinated, but the postganglionic neuron, and there's a tiny little one right here, is unmyelinated. So that's something that we'll bring up also towards the end of this lecture series, is the preganglionic neurons are myelinated, postganglionic neurons are unmyelinated. Okay, so let's take a look at the functional difference between the two. So I used these cute little animals to give you a visual to try to remember the big picture in the function, the response of bodies of what they do when there's sympathetic versus parasympathetic response. So I'm going to talk about this scared dog here on the left, not the German Shepherd, even though he's probably in sympathetic response as well. So the little one that's ears are flapped way up and it's kind of going, whoa, get this big mean dog out of my face. So sympathetic activation, we sometimes, let me find a better color, might have heard of fight, flight, or freeze. So these are, it's kind of like a mnemonic, fight or flight or freeze, plus I'm going to throw exercise in there. Because exercise, your body kind of does all these things too. So fight or flight or freeze. So you're in a crisis mode, you're either running away or fighting, or you just are so stressed that you just kind of can't do anything. This is all regulated by the sympathetic response. So what does that look like? Well, I've just made a bulleted list here. So this is just a general overview. We'll see more details in the notes and as you go through the book. Heightened mental alertness. So imagine this is going to come into play when you are in a crisis. So you need to be able to kind of process things in your brain a little bit more. Increased metabolic rates. You're going to be burning your fats and sugars to give your muscles energy to move and your neurons glucose to think. Reduced digestive and urinary functions. Those are non-vital functions at this moment of crisis. So blood usually gets diverted away from those organs into the skeletal muscle and brain. Activation of energy reserves, those adipocytes, the release of glycogen from your liver, all the dumping nutrients into your bloodstream to then go and be metabolized by your skeletal muscle and brain neurons. To drive all of that increased metabolic activity, we have an increased respiratory rate and airflow to bring in oxygen and get rid of the excess carbon dioxide that's being produced. Increased heart rate and blood pressure because we are needing to feed all of these more active tissues. And then also because of all of that skeletal muscle activity, we're going to be producing heat, and so sweat glands are activated to dissipate that excess heat. So think about maybe the last time you may have been in one of those situations, fight or flight or freeze, or when you're exercising. You should be able to check almost every single one of those boxes as something that you can recognize when you are in sympathetic activation. Now let's take a look at the sleeping kitty and the food plate here. This is the mnemonic that I like to use. It's called rest and digest. Okay, so rest and digest. So this is pretty much all the other rest of your time that you are living when you are not in sympathetic activation. These crisis moments do not last for a very long time. They shouldn't last for a very long time. You shouldn't be exercising 23 hours of the day. Clearly, somebody else has to be in control when you're not in this sympathetic activation. And that's the job of the parasympathetic division, is to control everything else. So we have, if we take a look at the response, it's typically opposite of the sympathetic activation. So decreased metabolic rate, decreased heart rate and blood pressure. It's not listed here, but it would be a decrease in your respiratory rate. But then, because we're not in this crisis mode, we can kind of tone down our skeletal muscle and our brain function and ramp up those other things like digestive function, urinary function, secretion of salivary glands and digestive juices, increase of smooth muscle contractions along your digestive tract to kind of keep things moving. And you'll have an increased inclination for urination and defecation as those digesting and blood filtering processes are heightened because you are not in an emergency crisis. So, you're sleeping, parasympathetic activation is going to be high. You've just eaten dinner, you're hanging out on the couch watching some TV, parasympathetic is going to be in full swing. Just, sitting at your computer watching this video, unless it really freaks you out, you're going to be in rest and digest unless you're having some kind of panic attack by watching A&P videos, who knows? So this is the big picture. So I do this overview because as we start diving into the details of sympathetic and parasympathetic anatomy and neurotransmitters and neural pathways, that I don't want you to lose sight of what it is that you're learning. Just the different ways that the nervous system is organized to carry out a fight or flight response or a rest and digest response of your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, right? And that's it. Okay, so that wraps up this introduction to the autonomic nervous system. The next video will be over sympathetic activation, or sympathetic division. I'll see you next time. Bye.